There's this joke of my rabbi's so brilliant, he can talk about anything for an hour. And the other guy says, my rabbi's so brilliant, he can talk about nothing for 2 hours.
That was Rabbi Stephen Leder, kicking off this best of episode of the Maggid Method. And I'm Daniel Steinberg. Today, we'll hear from some of the best congregational leaders in the business, past and present, relating some of their greatest stories, jokes, and sometimes hilarious anecdotes of their careers. To start us off, let's hear one of my favorite jokes told by Rabbi Adam Starr from Congregation Or Torah in Atlanta, Georgia.
There's the story about the guy with the tochacha, in which they were having trouble finding who would get the tochacha aliyah. And so they found a guy, Yankala, the schlepper, and they paid him to get the tochacha aliyah. And so there they are, and they're at Shacharis, and Chazarat Shas are looking around. He's not there. What's going to be? So then they bring up the Torah. He's still looking around. Where is he coming? Is he coming? And they start the Torah reading. It's getting really close, and about to get to the aliyah for the tochacha. He comes running in the schwitzed, and they're able to call him up for the tochacha, and they call him up for the tochacha, which is the rebuke. So nobody really wants it, right? And they give it so he gets the aliyah. But they said after that, well, we've been so nervous here. I've been waiting for you. We paid for you to do this. What took so long? He said, you think I can make a living on doing this just at one shul?
Oh, that's really funny. I've never heard that before.
You've heard that before? Okay, I thought I would like that's too classic.
Oh. Next up, we have two fascinating anecdotes told by Rabbi Dr. J.J. Schachter. One about the Rav Soloveitchik, and the other one is about his father, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, and his good friend, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb.
I'll tell you another related story that comes to my mind. And this I heard from Rabbi David Shapiro, who was the principal of the Maimonides School in Boston. This is a story for the ages. And anybody listening to this needs to know this story and should never feel guilty if they walk in with an index card. He told me that Rabbi Soloveitchik, as we know, was the founder, actually his wife, in 1937, founded the Maimonides School. And the Rav, all the years, lived in Boston, used to commute to New York to teach at Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. He used to fly out Tuesday morning, come home Thursday night, and was very invested. His wife, all the time, she was head of the school committee at Maimonides, but he was very invested. And David told me that a couple of times he used to invite the Rav to come to school on Friday to walk around the halls, to go into classrooms, to interact. He told me I once invited him to speak to the kindergarten. So he comes in. First thing you understand, the kindergarten chairs are like here, so they had to go schlep out a chair for the Rav to sit on without him hurting himself. And then he sits down at the kindergarten and he puts his hand in his pocket and he takes out an index card. Oh my God. David, whatever chair David was sitting on, he fell off. I mean, that's unbelievable. He thought in advance.
Prepared remarks for a kindergarten.
What am I? You understand? He's not used to talking to kindergarten kids. So he can't come in and talk about existential and ontological and axiological. I mean, it's not happening. So he's got to think in advance, like, what am I going to say that's going to work in this context? So he pulled out an index card. That's amazing. So my father was older, and he used to work at YU, and I went to visit him once, and we're walking outside, and he had a cane. He was already elderly, needed a cane. So Dr. Norman Lamb was then the president of YU, was walking towards him, and they were friendly for 50 years. So Dr. Lamb says to my father, Reb Herschel, Lo yeyaseh kain bimkaimenu. And in a second, my father said, in a nanosecond, he said, Reb Nachum, al kain nekave lecha. Now that's genius.
Yeah.
Dr. Lamb said, Lo yeyaseh kain, he used that before. But I don't know if my father ever heard that before, but in a nanosecond, he came right back at him.
While we're on the subject of Rabbi Lamb, I'd be remiss if I didn't include a few great anecdotes by his son-in-law, Rabbi Mark Dratch, former head of the RCA.
When I was first going into the rabbinate, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, J.J. Schachter's father, Zichrono Livracha, was was in charge of rabbinic placement at YU, and he was known as an orator from the previous generation of the Bronx and the heyday of the Bronx rabbinate. So I once went in to see him and asked him how's it possible to get a great drasha every Shabbat. So he looked at me and he had a very wonderful sense of humor as well and great sense of drush. So he looked at me and he said, you go out and buy the sermon manuals, $10 a volume, and you'll find one or two ideas that are worthwhile, which is not true actually, because many of those old sermon manuals weren't you couldn't even find one or two good ideas. And he says, and you can deliver them exactly as they're written. I said, but Rabbi Schachter, you have to quote your source. It's plagiarism, maybe olam, He says, no, he says, look, you're never going to deliver them exactly the way they were written. And a ganav is kona b'shinui. So that was his, many years later, I saw him again and reminded him of the story. He says, oh, I never said such a thing. One another Rabbi Lamb story. At one point, there was a member of his shul that was into producing movies and shows and those types of things, and he was developing a film of Saturday the Rabbi Slept Late. So a whole these series of mysteries of this rabbi, and Dustin Hoffman was chosen to play the rabbi, but Dustin Hoffman had not been a shul goer. So he didn't know what it was like to be in a shul and listen to a rabbi. So he actually came to the Jewish Center one Shabbat morning and sat with his producer and watched Rabbi Lamb in action to see what it is and what a rabbi does. And then after davening, actually came to the Lamb's home for Shabbos lunch to be able to debrief after that. And he said that Hoffman walked in, was very, very even shorter than Rabbi Lamb was, who was not a tall person, and wearing a fur coat. And he says, Rabbi Lamb, I get it now. You're like a conductor of an orchestra. And how you move your hands and your body language, your position and your movements and the way you use your voice. And Rabbi Lamb thought for a second, says, you know what? You're right. That's what it is.
I love this next story told by Rabbi Mitchell Woolberg, Rabbi Emeritus of Beth Tefillah in Baltimore, because at its core, it humanizes the rabbinate. Rabbi Woolberg takes us all the way back to the beginning of his career, when he was just 23 years old and was tasked with officiating at his very first funeral. But he couldn't contain his nerves at the prospect of having to speak in front of a dead body, something he'd never done before, and you'll never believe what he did in order to prepare.
My first position was a rabbi in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I was 23 years old. There 2 days, and the phone rings. It's a funeral home. A member of my synagogue, they tell me, has passed away. And we make arrangements for me to officiate at the funeral. And I hang up and I said, I've never been to a funeral. What happens at a funeral? So I called my father and he gave me some ideas. And I called my brother and he helped me form a eulogy. And then I was nervous speaking in front of a dead body. So I had my wife lie down on the bed. I don't have to finish the sentence.
Speaking of young rabbis, here's Rabbi Ruben Pupko from Montreal on how to know when you've transitioned from being a young rabbi to an old rabbi.
Oh, by the way, I have a joke for you. I was a young rabbi once. And at that time, I was in a suburb of Toronto, and I used to go to the rabbinical meetings in Toronto. And it was in the 80s, and there's still old European rabbis around. And the old Rabbi Felder Zatzal once made a disparaging comment about younger rabbanim, younger rabbis. Right? So I asked him in Yiddish, I said to him, when wird a junger Rav ein älterer Rav? When does a young rabbi become an older rabbi? And without missing a beat, he said that fangt an hassen younger rabbanim, when he starts hating younger rabbis.
I still get chills listening to Rabbi Pupko get choked up telling this next inspiring story. about the secret tzedakah practice of one of his congregants that served as such a potent example for the man's family that the practice got passed down 2 generations later to the man's grandchildren.
Wonderful guy in my shul whose father was a wonderful Baal Tzedakah in a very quiet and almost a unique way. His father had come from Europe. He used to go into the bakery before Yontif and go to the guy and says, give me your book, meaning the people owe you money. And he would sit there and pay off everyone's bill. Never tell anybody. Okay? Give me your book, he would say. And he would pay the bills for other people. His son did the same thing. Goes into certain stores and does that. And then he tells me a story about how he was at a wedding in New York. The caterer also owned a takeout store on the Upper West Side. He figured out who he was. And he tells the guy, he has 2 kids living in New York. You know, I've never seen something like this before. Your kids came in before Yontif, right, to pay the bills. That's a beautiful story. And that's about 2 things. That's about tzedakah, and that's about the things we see our parents do. How long they last, how long they echo. And we underestimate and undervalue our impact on the people around us and even on our own children. And what that does, the modeling of good behavior.
Here's Rabbi Kalman Top of Beth Jacob Congregation in Beverly Hills on the subject of long sermons.
One about the rabbi gives a 35-minute Rosh Hashanah sermon, and the 2 guys come over afterwards and say, Rabbi, that was an amazing sermon. Could you condense it into 2 minutes that we could then put onto the website in 2 minutes? And I says, I think I can do that. And the congregant says, so why didn't you do that today?
The venerated Rabbi Haskell Lookstein served as rabbi at Kehilat Yeshurun, commonly referred to as KJ, in New York City from 1958 to 2015. And as professor of homiletics at YU, he taught multiple generations of rabbis how to craft and deliver impactful sermons. In this clip, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, current Rav of KJ, gave me the inside scoop on the origin of Rabbi Haskell Lookstein's sermon style versus that of his renowned father, Rabbi Joseph Lookstein.
Rabbi Haskell Lookstein tells me that Joseph Lookstein every Shabbat morning would be pacing the room, his living room, for an hour and a half, so to speak, setting up the sermon. And Rabbi Haskell Lookstein said, I don't want to ever do that. And so he would have every single word of the sermon written down beforehand. The reason why he never wanted to do what his father did is because he wanted to enjoy davening. And he knew that his father, pacing the hall for an hour and a half on Shabbos morning, getting the sermon right. And then through davening, the wheels are turning, right? The wheels are turning throughout davening. And so it's hard to really focus on what you're doing. And he wanted to have everything written out.
Rabbi Leib Kellerman is a renowned lecturer, author, and currently the founder and dean of the Center for Kehillah Development in Yerushalayim. Here he tells a very memorable story, which I personally used as an illustration of the gap between knowing something on a merely intellectual level and really knowing it in your core, to the point where it actually influences your behavior and actions.
There's a story, I'll give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. There's a story about a fellow who was about to attempt suicide. And he was standing mamash outside the window when a talented social worker who was part of the police unit for dealing with suicides showed up. And the police and the police psychologist had already failed to talk the person off the edge. And the social worker walked in, understood the situation. She was very clever. She said, just keep him from jumping for another 10 minutes. And she left the room. She came back 10 minutes later, with a watermelon. She leaned out the window, she said, "Excuse me," and she dropped the watermelon. And the guy came back in.
Last up for today, we hear not from a congregational leader, but a school teacher and a world-renowned storyteller, Matthew Dix. He's an unprecedented 60-time Story Slam competition winner and TEDx speaker. You can find my full hour-long interview with Matthew, which is a masterclass on storytelling, wherever you access this podcast. So check it out if you haven't heard it already, and bookmark it for future reference to keep coming back to. It's packed with invaluable storytelling advice from one of the best in the business. In this clip, I asked Matthew, is there anything you should never talk about when speaking from the pulpit or the stage? And what follows is one of the strangest stories I've ever heard.
I was at a Moth Story Slam a few years ago in New York, and a woman took the stage. It was unbelievable. She took the stage and she began telling the story about her abusive husband and how he was threatening to harm their child. And she had the man murdered to protect her child. The room went silent when she said it. And she said it essentially to the effect of, "And so I killed him." And we sort of didn't believe her at first, but we were all stunned in silence. And we immediately went to our phones and looked it up. And we found out it was true. The Innocence Project had actually gotten her released. She had hired someone to kill her husband because he had threatened the life of her child. And she had spent 22 years in prison and had just been released and decided to come to the Moth and tell the story. And that was the kind of story that I would think, I don't know if you can tell that story and be received well by an audience. And yet she did, because she had had 22 years locked up to think about how she was going to tell that story. And that night, it came out incredible. She won the slam, but was not there to receive the certificate because she had to get back to her halfway house because she was on parole and she had to be home by 10. But even that story, she managed to tell with great skill and craft in a way that the audience appreciated what she told, even though it was a story about having another person killed in order to protect your child. So I think the line is pretty far away most of the time.
Hey everybody, I've got a new sponsor. It's my friend and colleague in comedy, comedian Eli Lebowicz. You might recognize Eli from some of the hilarious J-Sketch videos, like the one about the stresses of getting ready for Shabbos on a short Friday. My wife was literally crying from laughter while she was watching it, and we must have watched it 10 times together while she pointed out how spot on and brilliant each part was. Eli's performed at hundreds of shuls, schools, and JCCs across the spectrum of Judaism, and he always gets rave reviews. He delivers relatable, funny, and clean content perfect for any Jewish event. Listen to this short clip from Eli's stand-up routine. It's one of his most popular on Instagram. It's about kosher restaurants. I think you're going to love it.
You walk into a kosher restaurant that's too nice and you start doubting the hashgacha. You know what I'm talking about? Some places are really cool and you ask the staff, you say, "Hey, can I go wash my hands somewhere?" And they're like, "Yeah, we have a bathroom." And you're like, No. I don't need soap. What I need is a basin that's next to the bathroom that has a basket of bread torn up like it's the mashgiach's leftover tashlich pieces. And in the sink, there is a cup that is chained to the sink because apparently there's a huge issue of Orthodox Jews washing for bread but stealing washing cups.
Unlike a lot of comedians that shuls hire and later regret when they go off the rails with offensive material, Eli works 100% clean, guaranteed. Eli will have your crowd entertained without the rabbi having to promise he won't hire a comedian again for the next 10 years. And to book Eli for your next event, visit elicomedy.com, ELICOMEDY, elicomedy.com, and mention the Maggid Method podcast for discounted pricing. That's it for me. See you next time. Bye-bye.